Good morning. Welcome to The Human Author. My name is Jen Cantwell, and today I'm going to be reading chapters 22 and 23 of my epic fantasy book, The Warning. To learn more about the Light Chaser series, you can go to my author website at jbcantwell.com. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading. It's been a little while since I saw you guys. And you can visit me here on every Friday morning at 9 o'clock Pacific to hear what I did the week before. So here we go. Chapter 22. Adair grabbed a small torch from the earthen wall behind the garbage pile and beckoned us forward. We followed closely behind, the little passageway short and narrow. We didn't have far to go until we found ourselves amongst the children who survived in the picking fields. I counted 8 heads, and while I wondered if there were more hiding spots out in the fields, something told me that this group was it. Where had they come from? It wasn't the first time I'd met a group of impoverished children, but it was the first time I'd seen some so destitute. It seemed that in the past several months there had been little food, and bony arms and sunken cheeks faced us from nearly every direction. "This is my friend Bree," Adair said, sitting down in the middle of the circle, his legs crisscrossed. Then he turned to me. "And I know the other two, Kenneth and Brennan. Why did you come back? I thought we'd seen the last of you. Don't you know you're wanted? Him, too." He tilted his head toward Kenneth. I shrugged. Hadn't I always been wanted for one thing or another? Hearing about Kenneth was definitely not good news, though I supposed it wasn't too surprising. "We're looking for my father and Brennan here's sister, Regan. And then there's my grandmother, too. Do you know anything of them?" Adair, surprisingly, shook his head. "After you left, Zahn went wild, trying to kill anyone who had connections with you. Most went into hiding. Even we have to be careful now when we're out. Usually we do our picking late at night when the guards start to get tired." My heart sank at his words. You really don't know where they went? There are only a few places anyone could go that are still secret, and only a few people are willing to harbor criminals. He's been ruthless with the killings. If you make it past the fields, you'll see the results hanging in the main square. "But wait, how did you get into the main square?" Kenneth asked. Adair smiled. "I'm little. No one thought anything of me, and I can squeeze myself into tight spaces." I looked around at the children. Most of them looked terrified of us. It was only Adair who seemed comfortable. "Where are the people hiding then?" Kenneth asked. "They must all be somewhere." "Oh, they're here all right," Adair said. "At least most of them. Some managed to get out before things went crazy, but that was only a few. Most people who knew you well went underground. There are a couple of spots that Zahn hasn't discovered yet, but only a couple, and it changes every day." "So where can we find everyone?" "For one thing, you'll need a disguise, and the last thing you want to do is let anyone see you've got magic. 10 pieces of silver to anyone who finds sorcerers to turn in, even little kids who don't know their own power." This story was starting to make me feel queasy. While I'd hoped that I would find the home I'd left behind mostly unchanged, part of me had understood that what I would be facing would be nothing better than foreign. "So what do you suggest?" I asked. "How can we get inside?" Adair shook his head sadly. "It would be suicide for you to try. I know your family is in there, but showing yourself might make things worse for them." "You didn't answer Bree's question," Kenneth said. "How do we get in?" "You don't," a voice came from the darkness beyond those little faces. "If we get caught helping you, it'll be the last of us. We can't take that risk." A young teenage boy emerged. "You can stay tonight, but then you need to go." "There's only one place I'm going," I said. "Inside. You don't have to take us, but you can at least tell us where to go." The kid walked over to the circle, sitting down in the center beside Adair. "Nope, we won't be doing anything of the sort. Our situation is dangerous enough without the 3 of you to contend with." Come on, Kenneth said. You can't leave us to enter through the gates. You know that'll be the end for us. Tell us what you know, and we'll be on our way. I understood Kenneth's stance, but I didn't want to put these kids in any more danger than they already were. There has to be something somewhere, I said. I looked at Adair, and while he shook his head, I saw something in his eyes that made me think he would be on our side in the end. Don't you want to get rid of Zahn? The boy snorted. If you think our lives would be much better without him, you're wrong. Things have always been this way for us, just like they've always been torturous for the children in the orphanage. Nothing changes with his removal. But that can't be true, Brennan said. I'm pretty sure you don't want to end up in a dungeon, but that's where my sister is, trying to protect Bree's family. We have to get to them, and we will sit here until you help us. The boy frowned. I don't think you're understanding me. You're not welcome here. You can stay until the morning. He got up and moved toward the exit. Tegan, Cullen, follow me. The looks on the chosen's faces were enough to tell me that he was asking something unusual of them. They looked nervous, more nervous than they'd looked when I'd walked through the door. What were they up to? Adair didn't get involved, and soon the three of them were gone. He shrugged. That was Brent, he said. He's been here the longest. He got out of the orphanage many years ago. They don't really search for kids who go missing, but if they dare show themselves at night, it's back to the orphanage with them. Orphanage. I'd wondered before what life was like for the kids there. They didn't go to school, but I didn't go either. The difference was I was free, and they weren't allowed to walk the streets at will. Do you think we could hide there? I asked. Where? At the orphanage? Adair shook his head. That would be the last of places you might be safe. Then again, maybe you want to get arrested. It would certainly get you down into the dungeons. It might be the easiest way to find your family. But I was starting to wonder if my family truly was no longer above ground. Father hadn't brought any light with him when he'd returned. To another man, that might mean punishment, but he was my father, and that meant his punishment would likely be worse than anyone else's. Okay, I said, but I'm not willing to allow all of us to become captured by that man. He's evil. Nothing's going to change that. But did I know that? What if Zahn had been possessed by Torin this entire time? No, the things he'd done in his life were almost certainly on his own. Maybe he was working for Torin, maybe not, but I doubted he was possessed. I looked to my traveling companions. What do you think? We can try to be captured, but... Kenneth shook his head. No way, he said. We at least need to try. We're probably going to get caught anyway, but there's a lot that we can learn before that happens. Like what? I asked. Like where Regan went, Brennan said. And your grandmother. She took care of us for a while when we got back, before they took her. Grandmother. I'd been focusing so much energy on finding my father that I had nearly forgotten about her. You're right, I turned to the others. I know it's a lot to ask. There's got to be a way for us to get inside secretly. Can you help us? Adair seemed to think about this for a few moments. Then he nodded. He looked around at the other children, then said, Don't tell Brent. You have to promise me. This girl has helped me many times. It's time for me to repay her favors. Nobody spoke, not even me. Will any of you stand watch for us? The only one hand raised into the air, that of a young girl, younger than Adair. Lyra, Adair said, you are braver than all of the others put together. I might have thought the other children would have been jealous of this, but the look of fear on every face was enough to tell me they were happy they had not been chosen. When? I asked. Now? Lyra was already on her feet. That depends, Adair said. Where do you want to go? Where's the safest place? Kenneth asked. Where can we hide? Adair shrugged. Here, honestly. Are you sure you want to do that? To hide inside the castle? If you are in hiding, how will you find the others? It's that or straight to the dungeons, yes? Kenneth said. Suddenly, Adair's head lifted. I have an idea, he said. You know how all of the market tents back up to the picking fields? Of course, I said, but a look of recognition dawned upon Lyra's face. Yes, she said. I'll leave right now. She pushed her way past us and moved to the exit, quickly leaving us behind. Ah, good, Adair said. There's one tent in particular that has a secret exit. He turned to Kenneth. We've stolen food from there on occasion. I'm sorry. Now, Lyra's face was not the only one that seemed to know what Adair was talking about. It's no bother to me that you stole my father's food, Kenneth said, but you must know there's a bounty on my head as well. My family won't stop. They won't let me get away. Most of them won't, Adair agreed. But I've seen your sister, and she looks miserable. Now, instead of you guarding the tent each night, she does. It will get you to the next step, just a bit closer to finding your father. But despite Adair's help, I found myself beginning to worry. Being in danger was nothing new, but how was I to break out 3 prisoners from the dungeons unless I was down there myself? Maybe I should just have turned myself in. It certainly would have been the fastest way to get to them. I looked over at Kenneth and Brennan, and I realized why I couldn't do it. They were my friends, and despite the occasional disagreement, I owed them my life, and they owed me theirs. There was a bond I wasn't ready to break. Finally, I turned back to Adair. Take us as far as you can. Then we will simply have to do the rest on our own. He nodded, then got to his feet. Let's get going, he said. The night is wasting. There were a variety of tunnels that led from garbage pile to garbage pile, and surprisingly, they didn't smell so bad. In fact, the ceilings of those little passageways had mostly broken down to earth, and the smell was mossy and rich. We didn't talk as we went, for it took concentration to stay low and not knock our heads against the tunnel walls. Finally, Adair stopped walking near an opening in one of the tunnels and stuck his head up to get a gauge on whatever was going on outside. Suddenly, he ducked back down again, putting his finger to his lips. He moved to extinguish the torch, but I grabbed his hand before he could do it. No, I whispered, it'll smoke. His eyes widened, and it seemed he was embarrassed. Then he nodded and passed the torch back to Brennan to hold. He sat down near the opening, pushed his back up against the wall, and waited. I did as he did, and it wasn't a moment too soon, for I heard the clanking of steel boots, at least 2 pair, up above. Where did they go? One voice said, a gruff and manly tone. The other man sighed, irritated. It's always the same with these little rats, isn't it? And what's the point, anyway? If we put them back into the orphanage, they'll just eat more of the food that should be ours. That may be true, but I'd take an empty belly in exchange for Zahn's wrath any day of the week. My stomach sank as I heard this. It wasn't that I hadn't believed the stories my friends had told me, but now that we were up against the castle's outer walls, the whole thing seemed much more dangerous than it had when we were just talking. I wondered what they meant by Zahn's wrath. I could only imagine. I remembered Ronan and his stories of torture that had lasted so long he couldn't even remember how long he'd been possessed. And then there was Colm, whom we determined had been trapped for centuries in the Togue forest. Torin's doing? Maybe just his influence had been enough. Finally, after the 2 men had argued a bit, they retreated, their armored footsteps clanking as they retreated back toward the city. Now's the time, Adair said. While they're not looking, they won't expect us to follow them. This time, when Adair went to extinguish the torch, I didn't stop him. I looked at the sky above the picking fields and was relieved to find that there was no moon, at least not yet. So when Adair moved back toward the entrance, I followed him without question. Only Kenneth argued. We can't go now, he whispered angrily, grabbing onto my arm. They'll see us. This is his game, I said, pointing to Adair, who was now halfway out of the cave. He's the one who can help us through all of this. He's just some kid we don't know, Kenneth said shortly. I frowned and grabbed my arm out of his grip. I know him, and that should be enough for you or anyone who wants to follow me into danger. Because haven't we all known there was bound to be danger on this trip? He didn't answer. I'm going, I said, looking at Brennan. You? He didn't say a word, but he nodded, pushing past Kenneth, who folded his arms. Fine, he said, but I don't like it. It's too dangerous. It's too... But I didn't feel like listening to another lecture. If there's some abandoned tunnel you know of that can lead us straight from here to the dungeons unseen, then by all means, let us know, I said. For a moment, he glared, but when he heard Adair call for us from the mouth of the tunnel, his face softened. There was something about Adair, some sort of quality that made him seem ancient and full of wisdom, so unlike any of the other children in the kingdom. I always got the impression that he knew something I didn't. That was reason enough for me to follow him, his bag of tricks. He ducked back into the tunnel. We have to move now, he said. They're going to see us if we stay too far behind. This revelation seemed faulty to me, but this was Adair's circus, not mine. He led us up out of the tunnel, indicating that we should remain crouching low as he darted from the opening to the next pile. We moved like that, from one pile to the next, and I was flabbergasted that the guards didn't sound the alarm. Then I realized that maybe no one was watching from above. Maybe it was the job of these two men to guard this part of the kingdom, and as such, no one else thought to look. At least I hoped this was the case. It wasn't until we reached the edges of the city that we slowed down, waiting for the lawmen to make the next move. But with little more than a backward glance, they began to make their way up the roughly hewn staircase toward the towering wall above. Adair put up one hand, indicating that we should stop moving, and the four of us watched quietly as the soldiers turned away. Then he was suddenly running, and I saw the old familiar tents that made up the market stalls on the street market above. He beckoned us forward, but he didn't look back. He was a kid who'd learned to live, not only on the streets, but as the poorest of the poor. Adair and his friends were looked down upon with disgust. Maybe this would be the opportunity he'd been waiting for to show the world, to show them all, that they were wrong about him and his small army of children. I briefly considered Brent, but when I pushed the idea of this young leader out of my head, whatever Brent meant to the children, it didn't seem to apply to Adair. Finally, as we scrambled up the short hillside that bordered the stalls, we were undetectable from the top of the lookout walls, and we were able to catch our breaths. That was insane, Kenneth said. We could have been killed. He saved us, I said. We wouldn't have gotten this far without him. Adair seemed oblivious to our conversation, but he finally turned toward us. It doesn't matter, he said, because we're here already. He turned toward the market stall we'd stopped behind and pulled open the canvas to reveal to us Kenneth's father's shop. He might have thought that this mission would lead to our safety, that he could help us toward victory, but he couldn't have known. No one could have known what would await us on the other side of that canvas, for as he opened it and gestured for us to get inside, we were met by a most unwelcome man standing on the other side, Kenneth's father. Chapter 23. I immediately threw a curse at him. But I was so surprised that my aim was off, and I hit him in the shoulder instead of the chest. Still, he fell to the ground, gripping onto the injury and yelling in pain. Kenneth looked at me, but I soon found that he was more concerned about the noise than he was about his father's health. That was okay. That was something I understood. I hadn't always been on good terms with my own father, and I wondered if Kenneth's had hit him just as my father had hit me. He put his fingers to his lips, then looked between me and Maddox. "Shut up, old man," he hissed, but his words did nothing to stop his shouting. Finally, I hit him hard in the chest, not intending to kill him, but only to quiet him. The move worked, and he lay back, unconscious. I let out the breath I'd been holding, and all four of us listened silently for any evidence of discovery. We heard nothing. We each crept toward the front of the canvas tent, and Adair stuck his head out, searching. Kenneth was down beside his father. "You'll stay like this until we're gone, you old crook," he said. "To think I let you control me for all that time." For a moment, I thought he might spit on the man. The look on his face so disgusted. But whatever his intentions had been, they were soon thwarted by the panicked words of Adair. "They're coming," he warned, and in the distance I heard the sound of clanking armored boots rushing in our direction. Adair didn't wait. He grabbed onto my arm and dragged me away from the scene and out the back of the tent once more. "Wait," I said as loudly as I dared. "We can't leave without them. Adair looked terrified, though, and he was pulling away. "You don't understand. The men are nearly upon us. It will be the dungeons for all of us if we don't get away from here fast." "But the others," I said. "We can't just leave them here to deal with all of that on their own, and with no magic between them." "I've got to go, Bree," Adair said, releasing my arm. "I can't survive in a dungeon. The orphanage was bad enough." So that's where he had come from. Suddenly, I found myself wishing for more time. "Can we hide there?" I asked desperately. A moment later, Kenneth and Brennan joined us behind the tent, ready to run. "Where do we go?" Kenneth asked. I wasn't counting on all that noise. "And now we can still get out of this mess," I said, looking at Adair. "Which way do we go?" I might have figured out the answer to this question myself. I was a street kid after all, but the rules had changed in Eagleview since I'd left, and I found myself in need of a guide. Adair took off fast, skirting the back edge of the market as he ran. There was nothing else for it but to follow him. Nobody spoke, and we all tried to control our breathing so as not to alert the enemy. But no more sounds from the lawmen's boots made it to our ears, and after a few moments we slowed down. "I've got to go back," Adair finally said, slowing, his hands over his chest as he caught his breath. "I got you here, but that's pretty much all I can do. My life is out there, not in here." He gestured toward the fields of garbage, and I understood. This was his home, rank as it was. "But where do we go next?" Kenneth asked. Adair turned away from the fields and peeked through a couple of the canvas hangings. Whatever he saw there made him quieter than even before. "You must break your way into the city if you're to find out what's happening now. There's a way to climb the wall. I've known others who have claimed to do it, but I've never seen it done myself." He looked around me, searching for further threats. When I saw his eyes widened, I turned to do the same. And there they were, the children keeping watch upon the wall, all of their eyes on me, on us. Suddenly, Adair took my hand and pulled me in a different direction. "It's all over now," he said. "There's no escape for me. Follow me." I supposed that he was right, that now, with the children's eyes upon us, there was no way he could run back into the picking fields without being noticed and ultimately punished. I gripped onto his hand and followed, the others right behind us. Where are you taking us? I asked. I can only take you to the place you wish to infiltrate, the wall that surrounds the square of the city. I hope you're ready to run and to climb. The noise from more soldiers echoed from the other side of the market, and I tried not to think of how many men were looking for us now. Had they seen Maddox down in the dirt of his tent? Or was he quiet still? Finally, we made it to the outer edges of the market and looked through the hanging canvas that housed the bread maker and his wares. Even in the chill of the night, the place smelled good. We tiptoed inside, but we needn't have worried. Apparently, the baker made his home elsewhere in the evenings. I looked at Adair. Did you know about this? About how he leaves all this bread out every night? Adair shrugged, but his attention was elsewhere. There, across the street, was the door to the flat I'd shared with grandmother for so many years. Was she in there right now, waiting? No, that was impossible. It was likely she was down in the dungeons with the others, if she was still alive at all. Still, I found myself desperate to see her again. I made a move to break through the tent and sprint toward the door, but before I had the chance to throw caution to the wind, I felt two hands on both my arms. I glanced back, angry, and found both Adair and Kenneth were holding me back. Don't be stupid, Kenneth hissed. We need to hide, especially now that my father knows we're here. Your old place will be the first place they'll look for us. But what if she's still in there? I asked. What if they're using her like bait? No, Adair said. They don't know you're here yet. They'll wait until you show yourself before using her against you. But I can tell you that it's unlikely she's still there. I can't say whether or not she's in the dungeons, but they took her somewhere. I looked at both of them, unsure and panicked. Then where do we go? Suddenly, I was feeling more desperate than I had in a long time. I'd met many friends along the path I walked since leaving Eagleview, but none of them were as important to me as my family. If we can get close enough to the gates, I can show you the way to break into the inner square. It will be risky, but I've done it before. He looked over his shoulder and his face dropped. Was he leaving them behind, the only family he'd ever known? Okay, I said, but I don't know how you think we're going to get that far. That was when I saw Adair smirk. He looked self-assured, even excited by the idea of breaking the law. It reminded me of myself months and months before. I'd been a street rat long before I'd ever been told I was special in some way. Kenneth, I knew, had some of that in him as well. And Brennan, well, he may have not grown up on the streets, but he'd seen more danger than the rest of us put together. I was amazed he was able to carry himself as bravely as he was. Adair held out his hand and took mine. Let's go, he whispered. We were fast. Every one of us had known what it was like to be chased, but speed wasn't faster than the shout of a lawman. We needed to be careful, too. Still, Adair seemed to know his way around this city even more than I did. First, we wound our way in and out of the market stalls, their owners still asleep. Outside, though, the sound of boots increased. Did they know it was me? I wondered what might happen to Kenneth's father. Would they blame him in some way? No, I'd injured him badly enough to instill the trust of the lawmen. They might not even be able to rouse him. It would buy us a little time, but not much. Finally, we came to the last tent, and this one was occupied. The tent's owner didn't even wait to hear our explanations. He simply opened his mouth and shouted into the night. They're in here! He ran to the front of the tent, but Kenneth stuck out his foot and tripped him. As much as I knew about magic, I didn't know how to quiet another person. I'd never learned that particular trick, but now that I didn't have it, I wished for it. I looked at Adair, but it was Brennan who came forward, surprising me. Curse him, he said. Do it now before they hear. He wasn't wrong, but there was something about cursing a man who already lay sprawled upon the ground that gave me pause. Still, this was no time to delay and ponder the morality of what I needed to do. I raised my hand and shot a bolt of lightning at him, striking him in the chest as I'd done to Kenneth's father. The man looked shocked, his eyes wide as he rolled over on the ground and stared at the ceiling. Was he dead? Did it matter? I found it did, and I approached him, kneeling down beside him and putting my hand on his chest. There was still a heartbeat there, and when he turned to look at me, he seemed overwhelmed with fear. He opened his mouth to speak, maybe to yell once more, but nothing came out. No sounds, not even a gurgle. I hope I didn't kill you, I said quietly, and I meant it. It wasn't this man's fault that he'd been trained to recognize me, to chase me and turn me in. It was simply something he'd learned, a way for him to survive. Probably most people in this city would have done the same. It's one thing to protect your neighbor, but something else to protect your family. Brennan reached for my hand and pulled me away from the man. The others were already disappearing through the tent flaps, and I knew it would only be moments before we would lose them. I jumped to my feet, gripped hard onto Brennan's hand, and ran. It took us a while to approach the wall. The lawmen seemed to be on high alert now. The warning from the man's voice had ruined our element of surprise. The closer we got to the center of the city, the harder my heart pounded in my chest. It's only a matter of time. Just go to the dungeons now. But I knew this was folly. Who was to say they would even take me there? Maybe I wouldn't be recognized, but that was unlikely. Suddenly, I found myself desperate for a disguise. Was there some way to cover my head, to change the color of my eyes? Perhaps there was a sorcerer somewhere in the city who could do such things, but I'd never met one. We found an empty shop, a proper one built with stone and topped with a thatched roof. No one was inside, and I realized that whoever he was probably in the dungeons. I wondered why no one had taken over his space. How many were down in the dungeons anyway? Unlike some other kingdoms, the cells below were not vast. I wondered how many people Zahn might be able to hold in them. Surely it was nothing as dire as those crowded cells in Zamira. I remembered them now, the frightened eyes of the prisoners. Had they known what Aaron had had in mind for them? Did the prisoners beneath Eagleview understand the reality of why they were there? Had anyone been told of Torin? Maybe his existence was treated as a secret. I couldn't be sure. All I knew was that I'd spent 17 years in this kingdom, and the only magical ruler I'd ever known was Zahn. The implications of that were complicated, and I found that now I still didn't know how the two men related to one another. Brennan shook my arm, urging me forward. I came back to myself, looking down at the man in the dirt. His eyes had grown wide, and it was only a flicker of a blink that gave me some hope that I hadn't killed him. I hadn't wanted to kill anyone, had no desire to bring harm, because who knew what types of harm each person might have already experienced in their lives. Even a glorious life is hard. This was something I believed strongly. Now, as I allowed myself to be dragged away from the man, I was comforted by the fact that his eyes followed me as we exited his tent. Someone will find him. The lies we tell ourselves to make it through another day. But the man's face was quickly wiped away from my mind when I saw my friends up ahead, crouched behind a stone wall, their eyes wide, fingers to their lips. Instantly, Brennan and I fell to the ground and crawled across to where Kenneth and Adair were hiding. Next to them, I put my back against the wall, Brennan doing the same, but none of us spoke. The danger of our presence in that place was palpable. The constant clanking of metal boots were ringing in my ears, a sound I was certain to take with me into my dreams that night, if there were any. "Come on, little miss," one of them called. "I'll split the money with you then. When Zahn gets to you, I'll give you your half." I was so terrified I didn't even raise an eyebrow or shake my head. Instead, I focused all of my attention on the sounds the men were making. They were mumbling to each other, perhaps sharing tactics and ideas about how to find us, how to find me. I looked at the others and not for the first time wondered if I was going about this all wrong. No, I knew that if I left them now, they would all be thrown into the dungeons regardless, and my abandoning of them would destroy our connections to one another. The only chance we had was to keep running, keep trying, and hopefully we would be scaling that wall soon. But when I looked over at Adair, over the usually confident face that had now turned fearful, I knew he wouldn't be joining us on that climb. I leaned over toward him. "You don't have to come," I whispered as loudly as I dared. "Just point us in a direction, and then you can leave us to our devices. You've done so much for us already." Fat tears fell onto his cheeks as he took in my words. I wondered how old he was, really, as I'd always thought of him just a couple of years younger than myself. But looking at him now, I realized that he was still a child. Maybe all of those funny smirks he used to give me were just a kid being smart. Maybe he really was just as scared as the rest of us. But he took a deep breath and rose to his feet, a new look of determination on his face. "No," he said, "I'm coming with you." He turned and peeked around the corner, and seeing no one was there, darted out into the road. At first, I thought he was nuts, but then I realized that the place was empty. Were they waiting for us? We followed closely behind Adair as he jumped from hiding spot to hiding spot effortlessly. As he looked back at us, I imagined that maybe he would have rather been on his own. It would certainly have been much easier for him. But he had made his decision, and I, for one, was happy he'd chosen to stick with us. But he wasn't the only one with their eyes on us, and soon the street began to fill up as if the morning were already upon us. It was hours before morning would come. I was amazed that these people would risk their own necks in exchange for a little bit of silver. Or maybe it was a lot of silver, but no matter, they didn't care about protecting one of their own. It was sad and frustrating and angering. I pulled my hood up over my head and stepped out into the street, the others following closely behind me. We were almost close enough now to the wall. We were just slinking down the slim street when I felt someone grip the cloak from my shoulder and pull me sharply to the left. I gave a small yelp, alerting my friends to my predicament, but the person who grabbed me didn't let go. Instead, she shushed me. "Shut up," she whispered, "and follow me." I couldn't see her face in the darkness, though her tone was familiar enough. I turned back to grab onto the others, but they were already following closely behind. The distant sound of clanking boots filled my ears once more, and I found myself gripping onto my assailant's hand and ripping it from my cloak. But as I pulled away from her, her wrist in my grasp, I was shocked at what I saw, for this wasn't an ordinary citizen after silver. No, in fact, this was one of the few people in the kingdom who might have been happier with the smattering of my blood across the cobblestones. She didn't smile, didn't even slow down. Instead, she called quietly over her shoulder. "It's up to you, Bree," she said, and I finally realized whom I was being saved by. Oriana's mother. All right, that's what I have for today. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back here again next Friday at 9 o'clock Pacific. If you'd like to learn more about the series, you can visit my author website at jbcantwell.com.